Welcome again to Orthodoxy 101, done by Father Michael Fulton here at Archangel Orthodox Church, which is at 1237 Landry Road, here in the God-protected city of Lafayette, Louisiana, right in the heart of Acadiana. So, we talked last week getting into church history. Talking about how the church formed, what were some of the environments that the church formed in, the atmosphere. We talked about the Roman Empire. We talked about the Byzantine Empire. We talked about the Jewish experience in the Greco-Roman world, and that sort of being the environment that the Orthodox Church came out of. Today we're going to start sort of part 2 of church history, which is the ecumenical councils. And the reason why I like to go into the ecumenical councils is because not only are they sort of bullet points, I think, on what we believe, specifically what we believe about Christ, but they sort of show us some of the politics that was going on at the time in the Byzantine Empire, as well as some of the challenges that Christianity faced in its formative centuries. So, before starting, I just want to ask everybody, what is an ecumenical council? What do people here think of when they hear ecumenical council?
A meeting of the whole church.
Okay, a meeting of the whole church. Good. Okay.
Well, mainly bishops.
Mainly bishops, but it's a meeting of the whole church in that the bishops are representing the church, the people.
Not that the whole church would be there.
Right, not that the whole church would be there. That'd be pretty difficult.
Does that mean bishops from every location would be there in the next minute?
That is a good question. I'm not terribly sure how that would work now, because we haven't had an ecumenical council since 787, at least in the Orthodox Church. But I would think that, and there were some cases with some ecumenical councils where some bishops did appear, or they sent representatives on their behalf. In theory, all bishops are supposed to come to an ecumenical council.
But if they don't make it, it can still be a valid ecumenical council.
That's a good question. What makes a valid ecumenical council? That's something we'll talk about. So essentially an ecumenical council is synods of bishops coming together to decide upon dogmatic formulations and legislation for the church. Okay? We often look at the History Channel. We often look at the History Channel as well as that other awful channel, the Learning Channel, where right around Easter or so, or Christmas, they'll have secrets of the Bible or secrets of the church. And they'll talk about the ecumenical council and about how these were councils where the bishops got together and decided what Christians should believe, and it almost sounds very nefarious, almost like these bishops are sitting in smoke-filled rooms and swirling their brandy nefariously and saying, how can we get these people, how can we milk these people for all that they're worth? That's not the case. Ecumenical councils do not decide what Christians should believe. Rather, they articulate what Christians believe. And we'll talk about the need for ecumenical councils. Why do we have ecumenical councils? And there are several points. But before we get into that, just what do we mean by ecumenicity? What does that mean?
That's a $10 word.
That's a $10 word, okay? What do we mean by, what do you think of when we say ecumenical?
It represents all,
okay.
the whole.
Right. When we talk about the oikoumene in Greek, usually it's translated as sort of like the inhabited world. Or it can be sort of translated as sort of the fullness of that representation. But in orthodoxy, and it can also apply to infallibility as well, because these councils are infallible. But what makes them infallible? Well, the fact that they're infallible is because it's determined by the entire body of the church. By the grace of the Holy Spirit, the entire church has said unanimously, this is what we believe. That is sort of where we get into the infallibility of it. Now, for Roman Catholicism, how is infallibility determined?
Well, it's the Pope.
It's the Pope of Rome. It's the Pope of Rome that determines the infallibility of Rome, which we get into another $10 word. Roman Catholics have this, Orthodox Christians don't. Receptionism. And what receptionism means, it's the doctrine that says that in order for a council to be valid, it has to be received by the church. Okay? Now, there are some problems with that Orthodox Christians...
What does it mean to be received by the church?
Well, again, that's another question. What exactly do you mean by that?
Now, Father Philip says sometimes that the next council would affirm what had been done by the previous council.
Correct.
As a way of sort of putting a final stamp of infallibility on it.
Correct, and it will do that, almost sort of like when we have meetings and we go to old business. That's sort of how in the way that I would look at it. But reaffirming the infallibility of the previous councils that followed. But there are some problems with this doctrine of receptionism that the Roman Catholics have that Orthodox Christians don't accept. One of the reasons is that if the church needs to receive a council to determine its infallibility and its ecumenicity, then why, for instance, is the Fourth Ecumenical Council received by the whole church, but yet it's not received by Oriental Christians, for instance? It's not received by Coptic Christians. Or
Meaning not accepted by them?
It's not accepted by them. They have not received it. So, technically, sort of by virtue of receptionism, they're okay. Even though they're in the wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some debates and things about Chalcedon and some language that Oriental Christians and Coptic Christians will say, well, we believe exactly like you believe, but we don't believe in the wording. It's been sort of a back and forth debate with Orthodox Christians, which is why we've been in dialogue with them. From what I can tell, we're sort of this close from almost being in communion with them. It's close, but it's no cigar. But they just will not accept Chalcedon. And we'll talk a little bit about that later.
I have a question.
Yes.
If an ecumenical council is called for the purpose of articulating and putting into concrete definition, previously kind of gray or questionable doctrine of the church, and ecumenism means for all, universality, the same almost as Catholic. Where does the definition of ecumenism from the point of it meaning universal, where does, and it being to establish like church doctrine for the church aside from everything else, where does it separate from that and become the definition for sympathy towards other denominations?
The ecumenical councils should not be confused with the doctrine of ecumenism, which is a different sort of thing.
So
which is sort of inclusiveness.
Ecumenical and ecumenism, we can take ecumenical, would be universal, almost similar synonym of Catholic.
Not technically, but as far as what I'm talking about, as far as an ecumenical council, this is what the body of the church has decided.
I think we could look at it this way. Ecumenism is a modern word.
Correct.
And it comes from the same root.
Right.
But the modern word means joining all the churches together. And at the time of the ecumenical councils, there was only one church, at least at the beginning of that. And so it was defining what the church thought. it was only after all the ecumenical councils that there came to be, rival churches. That's not entirely true because there were some heretical churches, but these councils are really talking about the only church that was there, whereas modern term is bringing all the different kinds of churches together. So it's whether you start with the assumption that there's one church or whether you start with the assumption that there's lots.
It's a word that is used in two different lights depending on how it's used and whether it's in the modern or the previous sense.
Yeah, I think the best thing to say is it's two different words that come from the same root, so they sound a lot alike. But ecumenism is a 20th century coinage.
For example, the word cynic used to be a school of philosophy for some
now it's
people who lived in the street. Now it's a definition for skepticism. With a with kind of
the sort of sour attitude.
Right? So ecumenism would fall in the same category. It's got two different meanings almost for the word, the same as cynics do from the ancient to the modern.
In a way, it has a different root. So I mean, it has the same root but different meaning.
So when we call an ecumenical council, has the fundamental meaning of the ecumenical council changed if the word is?
No, it hasn't changed. An ecumenical council is not ecumenism. Ecumenism is a philosophy dating back to the 20th century that's more about inclusiveness, and so they're two different things.
My only with that is that if ecumenism is originally, an ecumenical council is designed so that we can establish, concrete what our church doctrine is. And today, ecumenism means bringing all the churches together.
Sort of obscuring all of
Then an ecumenical council almost sounds like a council, if an ecumenical council was to happen today, according to the meaning of today's word, it would be a meeting on how to find solidarity in other denominations.
But it would quickly distinguish itself because it would be amongst Orthodox bishops.
Right.
And really there wouldn't be a Baptist representation or a Presbyterian representation.
Right.
And so it wouldn't be looked at by anyone else as a kind of ecumenical.
Right, it wouldn't be, I mean, it was called ecumenical because back then, it was only the Orthodox Church. I mean, the schism hadn't even happened yet, the Great Schism. I mean, our last council was 787. So if a new council were to be called, it would be just for Orthodox bishops. As Joseph said, you wouldn't have a Baptist representation, you wouldn't have a Islamic representation. It wouldn't be that way. Ecumenism is a 20th century word. It's much, 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 much different from an ecumenical council.
Ecumenical is not the adjective word for ecumenism.
No, not really.
It could be. You could
It
say we're
could be
having an
used that
ecumenical
way.
gathering.
Yeah.
But when we say ecumenical council, we're referring to something in particular.
Right, we're referring to a council.
Yeah, I think
Like
the
you
important
could
thing
call
is
it
what the word
Orthodox
council.
ecumenism or something like that,
Right.
where it would be ecumenism within the Orthodox Church.
I mean, it comes from the
something
Greek oikoumene, meaning the inhabited world. At the time when the ecumenical councils were called, when they meant inhabited world, they meant Christians.
They meant the Roman
They meant the Roman Empire. And in fact, a lot of these councils immediately, and Romanides talks about this, John Romanides, that these points that the ecumenical councils make would immediately go into imperial law. So I think that's where the word comes from, as far as ecumenical. But if an ecumenical council were called today, at this moment, I don't think that we would be preaching ecumenism,
No.
that inclusiveness.
Now, the Roman Catholics have had additional councils.
Correct.
Do they call them ecumenical?
There have been ecumenical councils that have been, for example, Vatican II is considered an ecumenical council
By the Roman Catholics,
by the Roman Catholic
but not by
Church,
us.
but not by us. Now, we as Orthodox Christians have also had local councils,
Right,
but they aren't ecumenical councils
by definition.
by definition. So
Because it didn't involve the whole.
it didn't involve the whole, correct. It didn't involve the entire body of the church in its different administrative areas.
Yeah.
So, yes.
A priest had mentioned, had said one time that it was impossible for Orthodoxy to have a council because there was no emperor.
There was no emperor. That is another
Is-
problem.
Is that, could there be a council without an emperor?
That is a good question. And I think that would probably be something that we would have to decide as a synod of bishops. Would have to gather and, okay, well now we don't have an emperor. Emperor died in 1453, that was the last emperor. So how do we call a council? Does that fall on the responsibility of the ecumenical patriarch, who is in Constantinople? Does it fall on the patriarchates to call it themselves, or how do you determine that? That's something that I don't think that we've really figured out yet.
Yeah, and can anything ever be decided without the heavy-handed backing of an emperor?
Of an emperor.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are really practical questions. The emperor was the one who called it because he had jurisdiction over everything. So it was a practical matter for him to call it. But notice that between the 700s and 1400s, there's 700 years when an emperor could have called a council and didn't. And that I would interpret as meaning that they didn't feel that there was a need for one. And I think that one of the reasons we haven't come up with an answer to the question of who calls an ecumenical council is that we haven't reached the point where there was a widespread agreement that we needed one.
And I, for one, am sort of glad that we haven't called one since 787. That it's been a slow process. Because again, I mean, what would we call one? I mean, another situation would probably be, what do we do about the Americas? Because our situation right now is kind of interesting, I have to say. That would probably be one subject. What do we do about the Americas?
Jurisdiction.
Jurisdictionally. Are we a diaspora or are we not? I mean, which is a very challenging thing for me and for, I think, most of us in this room who are converts, where we've been born and raised in this country. And, are we a diaspora? Am I a diaspora? Are you a diaspora?
Are you Antiochian?
I don't know. So it's interesting to make note that the Antiochians we're the only jurisdiction here in the United States. We're not named after the Greeks. I mean, there is the OCA, the Orthodox Church in America. We're not named after the Greeks, an ethnic identity, named after a city. So that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, back on track. So why do we have ecumenical councils? Well, there are three reasons. The first one is to articulate what Christians believe. What do we believe? The second is to teach what we believe in the face of heresy. And the third is canonical legislation. For example, how do we choose bishops? How do we choose priests? How do we, for instance, allow apostates back into the faith? And so on and so on and so on. So, to get into sort of the meat of this, I'm going to go into the ecumenical councils and what they focused on. The first ecumenical council took place in a city called Nicaea, and that was in 325. That's the first ecumenical council, and that was called by Constantine. And this ecumenical council was called in order to deal with a problem called Arianism. Okay? Arianism is not, most people, when I tell them this, they immediately think that this has to do with like Aryan nation. No. It's named after a priest by the name of Arius. And what Arius taught was that Christ was not God. That rather Christ was a creature. And that he was created. That the Father and the Son did not share an eternal, they did not share eternity, in other words. They did not share beginninglessness, if that makes sense. I like to tell people, because it's always kind of fun to remember heresies by cute little names. I call this the Superman heresy.
The super what?
Superman.
Superman.
Heresy. Because then if Christ is not God, then what is he? I guess he's sort of like Superman.
Mm-hmm. Arius thought of him as kind of a vice god.
Right, or as a sort of a demiurge or something like that.
A supernatural being of some sort.
Right, he was a supernatural being that had powers. So that is Arianism. And Arianism, and most of these heresies we're going to see are what's called Christological heresies. Christological meaning that they pertain to Christ. Who is Christ? What is Christ? And why would Arianism be a problem if Arianism were true? Why would it be a problem if Christ wasn't God?
It questions our salvation.
It questions our salvation. Okay, that's one aspect. Okay.
Explain why it questions our salvation, because
Right.
I think many Christians today are actually Arians and don't know it.
Okay. It questions our salvation in that the whole point of Christ coming to earth was not only to free man from the bondage of sin, as well as death, because the wages of sin is death. Okay. But the problem is that Christ came to earth not just to free man from his sins, but to unite God back with man. Not only unite God back with man, but to also make man a glorified being. And Christ did that by taking on this, by taking on our human flesh through his mother. By God becoming both the second person of the Holy Trinity, becoming incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ. So that is why it questions our salvation. If Christ was not God, then it puts into jeopardy essentially mankind's future. What about man? What do we do about it? How is man saved? And if Christ isn't God, then really we can't share any type of, we can't have theosis. We can't share anything with God as far as
Would you say there's without the image of Christ, there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between the divine and the human?
Correct.
There's really no way of the human relating to the divine in an intimate way.
Correct.
At all, without the image of Christ. Christ reveals something that really doesn't make sense to us any other way.
And God entering into his creation as man is the best way that could be done.
It makes, because Christ has taken on our nature, it makes our nature, in some
Sanctified.
sense, divine.
Divine, yes. God became man so that man might become God.
Right.
Which it's an impossible thing for man to become a God.
Right.
But we can become like God. If that makes makes sense. And we can probably get back more into that when we discuss the Orthodox views on salvation.
Right.
And just how are we saved, and how does man come to know God?
But Arius,
لست أقول سرك لآذى